delighted to invite Rohit Dasgupta from Loughborough University, who's going to talk today about the queer university in India. So we're going to internationalise the discourse. Over to you, Rohit.
Thank you so much, Louise, and thank you everyone for inviting me to this. So whilst we're discussing queering as a concept in the workshop today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the pedagogical concerns of teaching queer studies in Indian universities and the way in which the teaching of queer studies in itself becomes a form of resistance to heteronormativity and power. The current scenario in India remains unfavorable for queer studies. Apart from a few postgraduate programs in literature, sociology, gender or women's studies in a few metropolitan universities, queer studies is largely non-existent. A large number of students graduating with English honours or a major still remain ignorant of the queer dynamics in several canonical, contemporary texts or the sexualities of celebrated authors and filmmakers that they study. Writing about the colonial appropriation of attitudes to homosexuality in Indian literatures produced in the early 20th century, Ruth Vanita observed in 2000, the homophobic attitudes evident in fiction find their counterpart in the studied silence maintained by the Indian Academy on the subject of queerness. While picking up other kinds of critical theory generated in the Western Academy, such as Marxism, feminism, deconstruction, and post-colonial theory, the Indian Academy has by and large avoided lesbian and gay studies. She maintained this view even in 2008's revised edition of Same-Sex Love in India. Notwithstanding how some universities have begun including gay and lesbian studies in their curricula, Vanita is absolutely right. Using a pseudonym, Tarun, someone who was interviewed by Nivedita Menon in 2007, says, "The absolutely uncritical manner of pedagogy in school does not allow any space for alternative ideas to be expressed. In the absence of any dialogue on sexuality, the only learning is from the images provided by the books and the teachers who are invariably heteropatriarchal. The story is not very different in most colleges either. However, what is different is the availability of space outside the curriculum for student activism. While humanities and social science courses across India are largely imbricated in heteronormativity and continue to reinforce its legitimacy, there are not many Indian universities which have queer or sexuality studies courses on their curriculum. Homophobia prevails on campuses across India, and little or no organized attempts to combat it have been made. Although, as Tarun observes, queer-friendly spaces have gradually begun to open up in some metropolitan universities. The few university teachers who pioneered the official introduction of LGBTQ studies in the Indian academia have interesting, often upsetting, as well as funny anecdotes to share. Anecdotes which hint at the difficulties and resistances they had to encounter in their attempts to include sexuality studies in the syllabi, but also about queering the space itself. I shall return to some of these later. But first, it is important to examine what aided the emergence of queer studies in the academia in India. One must remember that in this particular case, it is impossible not to acknowledge the role of LGBTQ activism. Apart from that, there are several publications, conferences, seminars, films, documentaries, and other cultural expressions that enables the discipline to take root, notwithstanding how feebly or negligibly. Focusing on the development of queer theory and the various aspects of the LGBTQ movement in India, the Queer Studies course at the Department of English, Jadavpur University, which is where I studied, chose largely English, European, and American texts as literary case studies, much like University of Delhi. The course proposer, Paramita Chakraborty, recalls in a personal interview, "The course was passed without resistance. I believe few knew at the time what queer studies was all about. People were more familiar with gay and lesbian studies. The term queer was less available on the public domain. However, resistance was to come." A colleague was uncomfortable with Tennyson's In Memoriam being taught on the course, said Chakraborty. This relatively old school colleague, visibly distraught, requested her not to usurp Tennyson and place him under the rubric of queer studies. Chakraborty had designed the course in such a way so as to include one text from each of the ages of English literary history, and thought In Memoriam was an important text firmly located within the Victorian paradigm, revealed intensities of a deep homoerotic friendship in an age which moralized against and ruthlessly punished homosexuality. But eventually, on being repeatedly requested by the colleague, she had to let go of Tennyson and replace him with the more obvious Oscar Wilde. Chakraborty, who shared with us an intriguing semi-autobiographical paper, Teaching Queer and Queering Teaching, Introducing Queer Studies at the University, which he presented at a women's conference held in 2008, emphasized on the necessity of queering the curriculum in order to contest the hegemony of heteronormative discourses, with more than 60 students signing up for her course on queer studies. Chakraborty rationalized the essentiality of having canonical texts and authors, such as Tennyson, in the course. She says, prescribing familiar texts which had been studied in other courses and contexts also allows students to focus on the processes of straight and queer readings of the same text, illustrating differences in modes of appropriation. This indicates how queer or non-queer texts are not predetermined categories, but it's the process of reading, reception, circulation, and canonization which determine the meanings and status of texts. For many students, this understanding was both new and empowering. It helped them define their own locations as readers and understand the implications of their social and sexual identities in their textual negotiations. Chakraborty's view is somewhat corroborated by Ruth Vanita, who in a personal interview says, when I teach a course where the title and main topic is same-sex desire or even gender and sexuality, I get a select crowd of students. But if I teach it as I do in almost any course in any topic, it reaches a wider cross-section of students who realize that it is a part of everyone's life, not just those who identify as queer. While universities in India replicate state resistance to recognizing homosexuality within the national registers mildly or aggressively, throughout the first decade of the new millennium, the state's repressive apparatuses continue to stage their homophobia unabashedly on various occasions. Raj Rao designed a course on LGBT studies and proposed it as a master's course at the University of Pune. Rao writes, the Board of Studies in English, an academic body made up of politically rather than academically minded individuals, promptly singled it out and rejected it, remarking that Indian students did not need such a thing. It is not hard to see why or how the Board of Studies felt the urgency to dissociate Indian nationality from queerness, unquestioningly subscribing to the anxiety-ridden post-colonial myth that gayness and lesbianism were corrupt Western imports. One may also mention here the objection raised by one of another colleague, Sumanyu Satpathi's senior colleagues to his course on sexual dissidence. He objected to the course citing section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalized homosexuality, something that was in force until 2018 when the Supreme Court of India ruled against it, thereby evoking the question of the national legitimacy of sexually dissident citizens. In both these cases, where the hostility to courses were of varying degrees, it is unsettling to see the repeated emphasis on the illegitimacy of same-sex love in India. Both these instances foreground a rhizomic power structure of a dominant ideology in which those who raised objections were interpolated. The abhorrence for any same-sex association and a cautionary evocation of a law that prohibits are both inherited from a colonial culture. This kind of moral policing is a classic example of what Bill Ashcroft calls the very complex system of opposition and complicity which characterizes the relationship between post-colonial subjects and imperial discourse. Discourses of mainstream Christianity and colonialism, which rejected the presence of femininity in man as virtually the negation of all humaneness, as Ashish Nondi says, were intrinsically intertwined with each other, and the colonizing enterprise was popularly viewed as a religious and ethical duty. Under such circumstances, when the community of the colonizers obsessed over their self-image as a community of well-defined men with clear-cut men-women relationships, anything that hinted at sexual ambivalence was mercilessly repressed, as Nondi continues. In fact, all markers of ambiguous sexuality were either eliminated or tactically concealed so as to not tarnish the colonizer's hypermasculine image. The current scenario of queer studies in urban Indian universities seems to suggest a change in the mindset of institutional authorities and students. Some of the older courses that I mentioned, such as queer studies at Jadavpur University and also new gender studies at Kolkata University, are successfully running today. 3 courses which have been introduced in the past 2 years deserve mentioning. Shivaji Panikar, whose scholarship in queer art is well known and who has been running a popular blog, Queer Way Art, since 2009, introduced a course called Queer Theory, Activism and Cultural Practices at Ambedkar University in 2015. In a personal interview, he describes the course as thus: taking exemplary instances from Euro-American and Asian contexts, the course will focus on the critical perspectives inherent in the formulation of the concept of queer, the post-structuralist understanding of sexual and gender differences and identity formations, the cultural practices that reflect these shiftovers, their radical breakaway points from the heteronormative status quo positions, will be the focus of the course. The course will also focus on practices that push the boundaries of what is accepted as the norm or the status quo. In 2016, the Center for Women's Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University introduced another course called Public Formations of Sexuality. This course, just like Shivaji Panikar's proposed, challenges formulations of sexuality in deeply entrenched binary oppositions that eliminate other forms of sexual expressions and intimacies or uphold them as unnatural. Working around the idea that sexuality should not be concealed within the private realm, but needs to be discussed as central to the making of the modern individual, the family, and the state, the course made way for analyzing sexual scripts that govern everyday lives and problematize the dominant paradigm of sexual repression and violence, and maps the contested, pervasive, and multi-layered terrains of sexuality in the Indian context. The course proposed to bring together apparently diverse fields of political and social movements. Interestingly, it also proposed to locate the idea of family planning within the discourses of political mobilized movements, such as mobilizations by sex workers, queer organizations, public health discourse on HIV/AIDS. And I can talk a little bit more about the ways in which HIV/AIDS funding has been quite crucial within the queer movement in India, or Paul's work being very useful over there. Ashoka University is another recent university which has introduced a Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality and states how such centers are policed in every society around the world, including India. They are issues of universal import that also take on different dimensions depending on their local setting. In India, the policing of gender and sexuality forms the cornerstone of many inequalities perpetrated in society. Equally, and I can talk about this more in the discussion, sexuality is relatively free when compared with the West, while gender seems more repressive. And a lot of this is to do with the invisibilizing of sexuality, where gender seems to be more of something you can go against. The Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University is the first center in the country to study the nuances of these issues concerning both gender and sexuality. The scholarly, policy, and media approaches required for the study must be pioneered by educational institutions which focus with rigor on these interrelated issues. The center sees itself as fulfilling this global requirement while being responsive to local needs. The center was set up in 2015 August and focuses on 3 areas of activity: scholarly research, social outreach, and media consultation. Whilst writing this paper, the Supreme Court has once again stirred up a new debate when it upheld the right to privacy, protected under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution as a fundamental right. The arguments in favor of this ruling critiqued the Supreme Court's earlier verdict that reinforced that Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. The Supreme Court said it is an individual's choice as to who enters his house, how he lives, and is in what relationship. The privacy of the home must protect the family, marriage, procreation, and sexual orientation, which are all important aspects of dignity. Adding, one's sexual orientation is undoubtedly an attribute of privacy. This Supreme Court ruling comes as a rejoinder to the Hindu fundamentalist majoritarianism which has precariously taken over the country. Hounding religious and caste minorities, to the extent of killing people for their food habits. The judges specifically mentioned this in their ruling, alluding to the mass violence against beef eaters that has reached an unprecedented aggressive level in the past 2 years. The pretext of this ruling is, however, the government's enforcement of the world's largest biometric project, the Aadhaar card, which threatens the privacy of every Indian citizen by making it mandatory for them to share their photographs and fingerprints, iris scans, and so on. The data thus collected could be used as an easy device for mass surveillance. In declaring that every Indian citizen has a fundamental right to privacy, the Supreme Court makes way for sexual identity to be protected and honoured under Article 21, but also really creates another kind of problem. Whilst this ruling, which is yet to become a judgment, seemed to ease the struggle to deconstitutionalise Section 377 of the IPC in the curative petition, which is yet to be heard. A piece of news which followed this ruling upturned the optimism which this ruling had been building within the LGBTQ community. The BJP government on 3rd September 2017, exactly 9 days after the above-mentioned ruling, refused to acknowledge trans people as the third gender in the country's labor law framework. The Wage Code Bill categorized the country's 44 labor law codes into 44 codes. The Labor Code on Wages Bill, drafted in 2015, had provisions prohibiting discriminations against trans people in matters of wages. But the Law Ministry objected to adding a separate clause for trans people, which of course infuriated the LGBTQ community. This chiaroscuro landscape of alternating hope and despair within which queer citizens of India live and their lives show that the struggle to obtaining and securing an equal life or right to love equally is not going to find a resolution soon. The future might seem bleak. One may mention that academics across India, particularly those who teach humanities and social science courses, are finding it difficult to work with the conspicuous curtailing of funds by the current government, especially in case of public universities. The introduction of choice-based credit system by the University Grants Commission in universities across India in recent times also comes with the apparently autocratic directive of having a uniform syllabus for a few undergraduate courses. While some universities have already accepted this recommendation without demur, a few others are trying to resist it as long as possible. For introduction of a universal syllabus controlled by the state takes away the university's freedom to introduce courses which could be more progressive than the prescribed ones. The university in India, as the recent months have shown, remain one of the last spaces for dissent and radical politics, one being eroded through the fundamentalist government. It is thus no secret that queer groups across the country are fighting not just for their queer rights, but have also joined forces to fight against the Anti-Discriminatory Citizenship Act, which would, in a document-poor country such as India, disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of people, making them stateless, using one's religion to determine one's citizenship. Last month, as I walked at the Kolkata Pride with the Jadavpur University students, they echoed the familiar cries of Azadi, freedom, a feminist war cry that was used by us during the Section 377 protests, repurposed once again by us queers to fight the monstrous Indian state. Thank you.
Stay there, so we'll hear Paul's presentation and then we'll take the questions and do that as a pair. Right. Okay, so I'd like to introduce you now, one of our homegrown academics from the University of Sussex, from anthropology, Dr. Paul Boyce. And Paul, you're going to talk about University Within.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know. It's a paper when you write it often ends up being something different to what you had planned. And this is really more of a conceptual piece where I'm just really presenting some ideas of what I think might be an evolving project, which I'm discussing with Rohit and Louise and Seth and Trude, among others. So in this, and I'm also going to cut some bits out just to save time, just so that we have a bit more time for discussion. So it will, if it seems a bit jumpy, that's why I'm just throwing some ideas out really. So in this paper, I want to wonder what it means to be a non-heteronormative or queer academic or student at the present moment in the UK Academy, based on reflections from my own working environment here at Sussex. This perspective is inflected with work I've also undertaken elsewhere, principally India, although I may or may not talk about the India case study in the paper, depending on time, and we could talk about it in discussion otherwise. In doing so, I want to offer some preliminary thoughts on the problem to hand, this idea of a queer eye on the university that this symposium is framed around. So such a purview of this idea of the queer eye might be interpreted as a matter of perspective. What does it mean to see things from this kind of given standpoint, but for purposes of the present discussion and meeting we are framing as queer? What does that mean? What kind of standpoint does that perspective come from? Where and in what domains of action and representation do we find the problem that we seek to address? The querying of absences and erasures and distortions in higher education. So I've sort of literally taken the title of the conference as something to think about. In exploring these questions, I want to proffer some analytical viewpoints drawn from across some theories that are influencing my thinking at the moment. I offer these speculatively as part of an unfolding project that I am musing on and developing concerning how we might bring different epistemologies and disciplinary perspectives to bear to a querying perspective on the academy. We are a knowledge community, as I said earlier, and yet it seems to me that often queer type ontologies and epistemologies rarely inform the way in which our institutions seek to enact gender and sexuality diverse inclusivity. This is paralleled as measures of prestige, impact and career success in the disciplines that make up our community rarely privilege or value queer interventions or paradigms. So if you're a queer academic, often your career is not going very far. So taking up such questions, I want to begin by noting that questions of perspective may be thought of as intrinsic to ethnographic theorising. So part of the project I'm doing is how can we bring our own kind of disciplinary perspectives and methods to these kind of questions. And this is especially interesting to me because I work in the Department of Anthropology, a discipline in which ethnography is sort of isomorphic to the kind of theories that we produce. Ethnography may be thought of as a methodology that in some ways queries the idea of method, blurring boundaries between everyday social experience and learning about social worlds through research. As the anthropologist Marilyn Strathern has described, ethnography could be thought of as a process of learning about social relations by having social relations. And that sort of in a way blurs the idea that we seek to put methodological. In terms of a queer perspective on universities, such an approach pulls us into the terrain of focusing on the social relations of queer experiencing in the academy. But this raises further questions about the problem of reifying a queer standpoint as if that's one that consolidates around the already decided queer perspective, as if that were embodied by these sort of decidedly queer peoples or protagonists, which sort of resonates with some of the things. How might such questions foreground a kind of a queering eye on the university? So returning to Strathern, because I just happen to have been writing about Strathern quite a lot recently. She has examined the qualities and problems of perspective for conceiving how ethnographic and anthropological knowledge making is constituted and institutionalized within our kind of environment. In a reductive sense, perspective might be seen to entail shifting viewpoints on a subject or problem, a means of comparative understanding predicated on alternative standpoints. This is something that I have written about. For Strathern, and I'm simplifying here, this kind of perspectivism might be read as a kind of unreconstructed view of anthropological knowledge, which famously, in a sort of populist sense, is seen as predicated on contextual comparison, on close ethnographic experience in a given locale over time. So anthropologists spend long periods of time in their research sites hoping to fall into social worlds, perhaps in a hopeful naturalistic sense, although they might be often kidding out. For Strathern, this kind of practice forms a starting point for a more abstracted meta-engagement with the project of anthropology. The kinds of constituting forms and assumptions that come to bear in the project of stabilising social entities and social worlds so that they might be analysed across shifting contexts. What kind of comparative dyads and subject categories are brought about in such work, and how do they relate back into our understanding of social worlds? This kind of querying of knowledge making about social worlds refracts for me back into the concerns of this present symposium. One way in which you might see problems from this perspective, the kind of problems we're discussing, is to notice ways in which queer subjects are pulled into institutionally dyadic social relations, predicated on our often supposed progressive inclusion. So, for instance, the university might make much of its support for LGBT History Month. A flag might fly over one of the buildings here, or Transgender Day of Remembrance. I mean, it might indeed be invited on a specific day to wear rainbow laces to identify ourselves as queer on campus, or to perform as an ally of the same. And these are things which are happening. Yeah. These gestures may be welcome, and I do not at all want to proffer that we would be better off without them. However, I do want to situate their performative politics within the terrain of the overwhelmingly gender and sexualities normative context of the university. This is amidst an often intransigence in many of our disciplinary settings to include or value queer epistemologies and perspectives as equally valid, as queer progressive, as important for student progress, and so on. And I think you were saying it's not then just about these, this is only for queer students, but what is the value? I want us to consider what kinds of dyads and other refractions of difference and exclusion are produced by these same signifying gestures of recognition and their presumed common sense view of what equality, diversity, inclusion looks like. I see this as often the performance of inclusion that is extraneous to really addressing the inequalities that are produced through our work as a knowledge community. One issue is that a lot of equality, diversity, inclusivity work in this arena with which we work seems to be taken forward by allies and others, often uninformed by queer kinds of scholarship in this instance. This problem of institutional action mirrors many of our mainstream disciplinary epistemologies, and there's a problem of knowledge making, I would say. What kind of knowledge about equality and diversity are we producing in this context, and how is that knowledge often being silenced? Recently, E.J. Gonzalez-Palladio, Silvia Pasocco and I sought to address some such concerns in a book called Queering Knowledge, and this is the project in which we were dealing with, in this instance, the anthropological work of Strathern and bringing it into conversation with queer theory. In sketching out some of the important labour that queer epistemologists can perform, we note, and this is a quote from the book, the work of establishing a distance from familiar assumptions concerning what appears as common sense resonates with the critical thrust of the interdisciplinary domains of queer theory and queer studies that have sought inter alia to disnaturalise presuppositions about the stability and coherence of sexual and gender identifications and desire. Whilst a minoritising view of the homosexual heterosexual dyad assumes a small, distinct, relatively fixed homosexual minority or perspective, in the universalising view, the dyad is generalised and reified to be universally important. However, as Eve Sedgwick has argued, lines can be drawn to circumscribe within some proper domain of sexuality, whatever that might be, consequences of a shift in sexual discourse. In Sedgwick's, what we call post-perspectivism, then queer does not delimit or circumscribe, but rather is tied etymologically and epistemologically to transitive relations and strangeness. Okay. So for me, this is an important proposition for the issues to hand in this meeting, I would argue, because it seems to me that one of the things that sexual and gender diverse inclusive actions in the academy, as in many other institutional contexts, often prefigure is a circumscription and they're putting parameters around the transitive capacities of queering. Rather, us queer types are asked to align ourselves with rainbow flags and laces in contexts that also dislocate such symbols from their political capacity and make of us and them part of a normative project of inclusion. And again, this is not to say such proactive gestures may not get us somewhere. But they're important in that they're being situated outside of more transitive power knowledge critiques, they are limited and arguably homonormative, of course. And as Sally, I'm going to really wildly summarise something that I also apologies already. These signifiers of the included, of inclusion, and the included and sort of apparently resolved queer subject themselves act as gestures that sort of articulate us to a performative queer veneer. In the case to hand, this might set up a sense of interior refraction in relation to our working context, as this interior rift that happens in the act of inclusion where we don't experience it. Specifically, and I speak for myself, these gestures of inclusion around and about us are one of the things that make me feel most angry and excluded, because they so often are not matched by real actions toward equal inclusion as actors in the knowledge-making community. I feel it feels that I should be satisfied, or that we should be satisfied with performances of inclusion, which. How much more time do I have?
About 3 minutes.
So I'm going to skip wildly to the end. So apologies. I had a whole discussion about queer monsters and.
Well, that sounds good.
Yeah. Well, so I use this sort of figure of kind of the Gothic queer monster, you know, the sort of the queer Gothic literature that arises in the European Enlightenment.
Why don't you take 5 minutes?
Blah blah.
And the question.
All right. Okay.
Let's
all
hear
right.
about the
Okay. All right. I'll talk about
monsters.
monsters. So, as I say, flags. These flags cast shadows. As queers and queer scholars, we know this. This is in part of the appeal of sort of queer monster theory, for example, as these enable figurations of our being in respect of a kind of more Gothic being. So ad-lib. So the monsters who this is a quote about Gothic horror literature. The monsters who began to roam through English and European literature in the Age of Enlightenment attracted and lured readers because, like the earlier figures of the highwayman, they embodied urges that were ignored or actively repressed by a society fervently dedicated to industrialization, social order, and scientific progress. Through Gothic fiction, readers could, for a while, escape from the cold, demanding daylight into the almost unthinkable thrill. And there's a whole tranche of queer Gothic monster literature, which some of you may be very familiar with. But then this is an argument I'm going to develop in the fuller version of the paper, and sort of link it also back to what you were also talking about, how the monstrous figuration also figures in the context of India as well. And Dilga Singh has written about also how queer subjects of HIV prevention in India also perform as monstrous figurations, presented as if they're part of a progressive inclusivity. But for now, I want to note a parallel to the enlightening gesturing of queer inclusion, for example, in a university, that makes of that inclusion a form of rainbowing. These erasures, this raises queer transitivity, capacity, and our roles as killjoys, critics, and negators. And I would argue, obviously in the case of academia, it produces scenarios where this is produced in scenarios where these other problems could be so easily and potently articulated. Because here we are having our discussion. Because we are, even if we're in a minority, we do represent a kind of critical group, which is probably one of the few kind of contexts within these kind of queer kind of discussions and epistemologies can be articulated, but so rarely within the performative terrain of queer inclusivity does that figure. These kind of perspectives, I'm skipping a whole bit on India now, but anyway, I'll come to the end. This kind of perspectives feel salient to me. What kinds of relationship within the university might we be seeking through disruptions or kind of queer incorporation? Are we seeking whole relations and commensurate inclusions, or are we necessarily producing partial connections that cast a provocative viewpoint on knowledge, power, and the academy? And what does this mean for how we think about our own disruptive orientations toward the heteronormative academy? The university gets inside us if we work or study here, inevitably. It's an object component of how the sexual and knowledge of the sexual, in this instance, is enacted and exchanged and made within and without us. For me, such processes do not feel like they engender a great relationship with the academy, because the sexual object relations to which one becomes subject engender a real sense of outside belonging, of estrangement. But we often stick around in bad relationships, trying to work them out, trying to work out something about ourselves. We might get stuck emotionally and materially. We might not be able to afford to leave. Right? The bad things about a relationship with the academy are multiple, and not at all unique to queer experience, as for example the imminent industrial action attests. But perhaps the capacity of queer scholarship to open up perspectives on power, on ongoing exclusion in the name of inclusion and progress, and the intransigence of normative power relations suggests that much of the untapped capacity within the academy that is so often denied and that bears at the heart of much of our discontent could be articulated through a kind of queer epistemology.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, would you like to turn to your neighbours again and have a quick buzz, and then we'll come back and have some questions. Great.
I think it really resonates with what you're
Yeah.
trying to do.
Provocations, let's hear it. Teresa, and would you just say who you are, please?
My name is Trude Rosenberg. I'm at Social Policy. I'm curious about queer monsters.
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering about what you see as the potentiality of a queer monster.
Yeah.
Because a monster is feared, but also might have some sort of power.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yes. One of the things that we were using, I didn't really get to talk about it much more in the paper, but it really sort of came to me when, with a colleague, Elizabeth Engelbretson, who you know, of course. So we had set up the European Network for Queer Anthropology, and we had a meeting in Budapest where we suddenly were thinking about the metaphorical resonances of different ways of talking about our experience. And we were drawing on queer monster theory to really yield metaphors for thinking that we might be persons, we might be Frankenstein's monsters, because we can never be a whole part of the academy. We're always like bits made up of other things, or we might be seen as vampiric and that we leech off other kinds of things. So really, for me, it was partly the potentiality for thinking metaphorically and resonantly. But also in the longer version of this paper, I also critique the problem of this kind of queer monstrosity as well. Because I talk about a meeting that we had in Tallinn with that same network, where one of my colleagues was saying, I don't get that. This is over-emphasising a sense of estrangement and negativity, and that they were saying that their relationship with the academy was much more productive and inclusivity. And they talk about the idea of the academy as something that we as queer scholars should seek to seduce, that we should bring this within our erotic domain, as it were, as a kind of, although somebody else in the meeting said, oh, that's being a vampire. So I just it depends what you do with the thing. So I'm not wedded necessarily. In the paper that's longer, I try to approach the idea of the monster. I was actually going to call the paper Monsters University or something like that, but I don't know enough about that film. Anyway.
Rosie Braidotti's work.
Yeah.
Let's have some more questions, comments, please. Anybody who hasn't spoken yet and would like to get in there? Yes.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm in the Masters in International Education here. And I was just very interested about learning more about sort of like the perception of queer identity in India, especially because it's through Hinduism and how Hinduism has affected. I feel like I know a lot about how Christianity as a religion has affected queer identity, not Hinduism. So like.
Yeah.
That's a can of worms.
It is a can of worms. Yes, I mean, I think, one of the things that a lot of Hindu fundamentalists love to kind of point out is about Hinduism being this wonderful religion where, you've always had queer figures from time immemorial, and Ruth Vanita writes quite a lot about this extensively in her book, Same-Sex Love in India. At the same time, it's also been something that's been used very much against other kinds of religion in India currently. And there's been this new grouping that's come out within queer activism, which is called Hindus for Queers. Oh, sorry, Hindus for Queer Rights, or something like this. And the whole and the way taking kind of monstro theory is about how much Islam is this monstrous religion which has come into India. Everything was all fine and dandy until the Muslims came and overtook everything. Nobody really talks about that suddenly, what happened during colonialism. So yeah, I think Hindu, and at the same time, a lot of LGBT rights activists have used kind of Hinduism and other religion to talk about how queerness, same-sex love, something that was celebrated both under the kind of the Perso-Arabic Empire and even previously during the Hindu, during the Hindu kind of emperor rules. So it's kind of both problematic as well as not, if that makes sense. Yeah.
There's another kind of scholar of Hinduism, Wendy Doniger, who has a book, the book Splitting the Difference.
Yeah.
So one of the things that she really emphasises in there was that alongside these seemingly very queer figurations that we can appropriate from Hinduism, we also get the idea of Hinduism which places gender non-normativity and sexual difference as also matter out of place, also as a form which is equivalent to kind of sort of dirt, right? And so there's this strange parallel going on where you have all these archetypes which are appropriated and both, and also this absolute matter out of place excision which somehow hang together with complex ways.
I guess it would be interesting to hear about self-reflexivity in this process, especially acknowledging that when you are queer, and especially in academia, you're often standing at more than one intersection of queerness, right?
Yeah.
So which sort of queer even gets into the academy
I
in
know.
the first place? And therefore what sort of knowledge is being produced as a result of that? So I'd be quite interested, especially in this current climate of extreme neoliberalism, and how you create a queer future that is truly queer in the academy when we're expected to all sort of go through this channel.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, the channel of bullshit is the thing that one encounters on a day-to-day basis. You know what I mean? And it's really, you know, I was in Delhi recently talking to a colleague who had been an academic in the UK and had found themselves sort of excised out through that channel. You know what I mean? And we were talking about our relative positions. I perhaps being a more acceptable figuration in terms of so on and so forth. I've found some kind of capacity to be here in a way that they hadn't, and although that also they found that when they were here, they could also sometimes also be exoticized as a kind of figuration that I wasn't subject to. But ultimately, the power fell more in my favour in that sense. And what does one do with that? Do you know what I mean? How does one reflect on that? The privilege which allows me, for example, if I can speak of myself, to reflect on the problem of the unaware of all the excluded voices, which, so I often find myself, for example, trying to teach things like necropolitics or the turf debate, thinking, why am I in the Department of Anthropology fronting all this stuff? You know what I mean? This is a bit absurd, and I feel embarrassed about it. You know what I mean? And I take it on and I apologise for it. I bring it into my first year anthropology teaching and think I'm doing this because this is not a diverse enough space, and it should be. So you're right. I mean, I think it is. You know, I don't bear that at all lightly, and your experience would also across both.
Yeah, actually, I was going to talk a little bit about Athena Swan. I don't know how much of you know about it. You know, it's this probably I would call this horrible exercise, more of an administrative exercise for universities to proudly display on their websites. We have got bronze accreditation. We are brilliant for women. And I'm the Athena Swan champion. And I remember when I was made the Athena Swan champion for my school, there was a lot of questions. It was like, you know, you have. I mean, I'm still on probation. I was early career researcher, and this is something. I mean, you know, I can come up. I can do the analysis. I can say, right, all of these are issues. We've got issues with how. In terms of the recruitment process, promotion process, women are not being, women, gay people, LGBT people not being recognized, But ultimately, I do not have the power to change anything. If anyone, it should be people at kind of, you know, professorial level or dean level or someone else. But ultimately, it does fall on people like us because, you know, we are the EDI agenda for the university to push that. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a big question about whose voices are getting there, whose voices are marginalized. From the Indian context, I would say that with LGBT rights activism, it has very much been about respectability politics and kind of the neoliberal respectability politics. The whole fight for Section 377 and getting rid of it was the right to consume love privately. And the idea of private spaces in India and who has access to it is very, very limited. So we are just talking about very specific middle class, probably men, who have that kind of economic access to those spaces. You know, in the last few years, having gone to Kolkata, you know, with Pride protests, marches, you know, where you've got things like dressing appropriately. I mean, they would literally say, if you have to go to a club, dress appropriately, which is more or less to say that, right, if you're trans, if you're not dressed in a certain way, if you don't come from a certain class, you will not have access to this space. So I think there's been a lot about who gets excluded within this debate.
Are you really going to ask me after every...
2 pints? 3 pints? Tally now.
All right. Well, my little two-penneth here was, A queer veneer, I'm so using that.
Oh, yes,
Still
you're doing
working
it.
with
Okay,
it,
thank
but
you.
I am definitely going to use that.
Yeah.
That is fantastic. Phrase of 2020.
Title of the next symposium.
You know when someone says something and you go, God, yes, that is what it is. That's what I feel about queer veneer. So thank you. The other thing I was thinking about was this. We keep kind of referring to religion, but indirectly. And how fundamental religion and religious ideology is to so many of these issues, and yet I think sometimes we are also guilty of collapsing religion and ethnicity together in a way which is really crude. And I was thinking particularly around, okay, so I know a bit about three religions: Islam, Buddhism, and Christianity, for various reasons. And within all those three, there are very vibrant, lively, left-wing socialist queer activists who are utterly invested in the belief system of the religion, and it is not a conflict for them between their religion and their queerness or their communism or whatever. So one of the things I think we're a bit guilty of, is to ideologically collapse nationalism and religious belief in a way which I think harks back to the point I was making earlier about being more careful not to silo ourselves and lob grenades at people who we have discomfort with or we disidentify with. And so that was my only other point was about, didn't India recently make dolphins legally persons?
Did they? Dolphins.
I don't know.
Dolphins. Yeah, I think last year or the year before, India made dolphins legally persons.
Okay.
Which strikes me as being an intrinsically queer moment in Indian politics, and also a kind of very profound challenge to liberal humanism in what my opinion is as an I think 2015, okay, that's 13. Oh God, right.
Have you just, is that true?
Yeah.
What does it say?
It says dolphins gain unprecedented protection in Indian environment. All topics. Yeah. India has officially recognised dolphins as non-human persons.
Yeah.
To life and liberty to be respected.
And I think Canada recently.
Silos.
Yeah, I mean Canada recently brought in a law that said, I think it was either a river or a lake.
Yes, I heard of that one. Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
when we're talking about these subjects and queerness, one of the points I'd just like to make is that firstly, religions are not the enemy, and secondly, our notion of what persons is in this debate needs to perhaps broaden.
Presentation now. Originally from Oslo, but now working at the University of Kent. Okay, over to you, Seth.
Hi, I'm Seth from the University College Union, equality support official with responsibilities for the LGBT agenda within UCU, which is created through policies by members at the annual members conference for LGBT plus members, and also through our annual congress, which is attended by all branches across the UK. So what I'm presenting on is the drawn from the UCU position on trans inclusion, which is over there, which was put together by using policy that we have within the union, plus also work that's been done on academic freedom, in response to some of the gender critical noise that has been around and remains around. It's great to be able to be at this place, this event. Events like this and conferences are very important for the thinking that can be done around LGBT plus and to be able to look at how we can move forward and what policy, what strategies we can put in place in order to be able to advance LGBT plus equality. And I think it's been put very well today that we're in a position of not only defending the gains that we have made, but also look at how we can actually argue well for further progress, countering arguments that are getting louder and louder, not just within the UK, but internationally as well, but importantly within the UK. And part of that has to be challenging the queer veneer. So, at UCU, it is our responsibility to promote equality and ensure the provisions of the Equality Act are implemented and adhered to by our members and in the sectors where we organise. So important to us is standing for existing legislation. It has been fought for. The unions have been involved with fighting for that legislation. So the law is important to us, but the implementation is even more important, and the meaningful implementation is something that we're constantly fighting for. This is also written into our rules. Our rules commit us to ending all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and stereotyping. UCU believes academic freedom is bound up with other civil liberties and human rights, and therefore does not give the right to discriminate. So academic freedom happens within a context. That context is really important to spell out, and I think that's becoming more and more important to actually be aware of how we can actually talk about academic freedom, freedom of speech, etc. But also looking at the maintenance of human rights, dignity, etc. So balancing all of that, it's a major discussion for today. I've tried to provide some pictures so that kind of like lightens it up a little bit. UCU is incredibly bound up with the intersectional approach. It is a fundamental part of our policy now to be advancing in an intersectional way, providing voice that not only talks about the equality protected characteristics in silos, but crosses the whole lot and looks at what it means to have diversity within the different groups. There's a guide to intersectionality that's been produced by UCU over on the desk as well. Okay. So the concept of intersectionality has at its core an understanding that within marginalized groups, there's a number of different identities, and those are important to give voice to. We've spoken about privilege already today. We need to address that in all that we do. Who has the privilege? Who is being able to speak? So that we can then look at how do we enable others to have the voice and to speak. Listening and trying to understand differences within groups from an intersectional position is key to building the strength of the group as a whole. There we have the word listening. And part of the whole thrust for debate is not so much about listening, but about talking and having my point of view heard. Hang on a minute. That happens alongside others. Let's listen to each other and understand differences so that we can advance together. Okay. 2 flags. What's the one on the left? Yay, good. One on the right? A bit more around. Okay. You might notice that on the UCU website now, we have the rainbow flag. That's this month for LGBT plus History Month. You can click it and find resources. So it does lead somewhere. It's not just a rainbow flag flying. And there's more kind of depth to that. During Trans Awareness Week, we had the trans flag up there as well. So, yeah. UCU supports trans workers' rights, and as champions of equality, we welcome the increased visibility and empowerment of trans and non-binary people in our society. Trans people, including students and staff in tertiary education, face physical and verbal abuses. This has actually come out in different research that has been had. The TUC recently did one about sexual harassment of LGBT plus workers. There's also been things within the sector as well. Prejudice and discrimination, marginalization and misrepresentation. UCU is fully committed to providing practical support through our branches, through our regions, and through our places on the National Executive Committee for reserved seats, etc., for reps and trans members in challenging discrimination and harassment. So I mentioned some research. We've got the Pride and Prejudice in Education, which was done in 2016, that looked at both FE and HE. It was done in conjunction with what is now Advanced HE and the NUS, and contains quite a bit of statistics and information that particularly potent within there was that so many students, LGBT plus students, were thinking of dropping out of courses because of things related to their LGBT plus identities. Sorry about self-promotion. And that is just the way it turns out. We've got a series of videos that are available, and they're really to give some voice to different aspects of LGBT plus life. So we've got it on gender identity and on kind of organising within the union. And this week I was just interviewing a couple of people on video in relation to intersex and also to bisexuality, pansexuality. LGBT plus voices, visibility and history are incredibly important for us telling our story and being able to get an understanding of where we are, why we are where we are today. It's important to ensure visibility of LGBT plus people in all areas, not just the rainbow flag flying, but also kind of make that more depth and look at what the experiences are. We'll go on, Trina will talk more about research that's coming forward, including family, social work, history, and curriculum. And it's a constant bugbear for many of the LGBT plus members on the standing committee that they're teaching, and they're often teaching curriculum that doesn't have inclusion of LGBT plus people within it. And that's something we really need to do a lot of work on. So keep a focus on international issues, including international working. There was an event recently in Northumbria University looking at LGBT plus international working. Came from a Freedom of Information request that was made by Northumbria University about what was happening in different universities across the UK around provision for support for LGBT plus people in relation to international working, especially in the context of there being so much illegality of LGBT plus and invisibility and lack of support for LGBT plus workers. And there was a concern that LGBT plus workers are being put into a situation of incredible compromise. And some literature that's coming out talking about that is talking about LGBT plus people having to hide their identities in order to be able to look at going to these international campuses that might be useful for some of their promotion. Well, actually, should we be not looking at how we can protect LGBT plus workers, not send them back into the closet, which is very much the discrimination of society, but actually look at protection and enabling careers to go ahead without having to take up those posts that compromise very greatly people's well-being and their partnerships. So this is a really big issue. It's a real consideration, particularly in the HE sector, obviously, where there's a lot of international working. A campaign is being held by UCU branch at the moment at University of Birmingham around a campus that's been opened in Dubai. It was a focus point of the LGBT plus members conference in November. So that again is another area which requires watching, looking out for. So voices and visibility, there's a copy over there on the resources table. You can also download this from the UCU website, plus also from LGBT plus historymonth.org.uk. And it's talking about kind of like the visibility, the raising visibility of LGBT plus people across the across history and contributions that have been made at different times. And honoring those particular contributions for those particular times. People change over time. But there's that. Then there's also the Trans Right Europe map is a really important resource to looking at where the trans rights exist. And Trans Europe has a lot of really good information on it, Transgender Europe. And then we have the Sexual Orientation Laws in the World 2019, produced by ILGA World. ILGA Europe provides one about ILGA Europe as well. These are really good resources for showing what the incredible difference is for people across the world. But we've also had opening today about India, and that it's not a glorious place, even though you've got legal status for gay people now. That actually being out and hearing about oneself and looking at queer curricula, etc., is not that easy. And we know that in the UK too. So, okay, so contacts. You got the UCU website, as I've already plugged. Myself, Seth Atkins, not Atkins. Yeah, it happens, don't worry. But never put the S on the end if you want to get me by email, because it will bounce back to you, okay? So it goes at the beginning, not at the end of my name. So, and that is what you get to when you go click on the rainbow flag from UCU website, is this LGBT plus History Month. And we've got the resources there, videos there, etc. So, and you can see on there where the rainbow flag is situated, and it's absolutely every single page of the UCU website. So, it really shows the kind of commitment that exists across UCU for LGBT voice, visibility. I think that's
Right, so I don't actually have any slides, so you can pick any of the flags that you might want to. I was going to start with I'm a tired academic, queer academic, and just walk off. But to continue that, I'm a tired queer academic, and what does that mean for my academic future? Might be more linked to what I'm about. Most recently related to the fact that I'm at the University of Kent, covering the number of TERFs that are existing amongst my colleagues, and I'm in the Department of Sociology. And I thought that was maybe not the case, and even more so, one of them is my academic mentor and is on my promotion committee. And what does that mean for me as someone that would identify as queer and non-binary? Now, the reason I start with this is because I'm going to talk about a project that I'm working on with Paul and with Seth, where we're trying to address some of these issues to understand more about the working conditions for LGBTQIA staff in higher education. And I think this links really well to Kat's talk in the beginning in terms of how do we counter these arguments of the heteroactivists. So where do we start? And in my eyes, it starts with identifying what issues are there. So what is actually going on? What are the issues that we are living and working in? What is the environment we're working in? Making ourselves visible, making the issues visible must be a starting point, and is our starting point in the project. And it's not only making our issues visible, but also what barriers are there. So what kind of walls do we walk into on our way through life as an academic in higher education. And I think, as I said, this is very necessary to be able to have some of these, to move on from calling it a debate, to see where we're going. And I was thinking, as we've been talking today, that working with the UCU might be a way of having a different, not neoliberal, competitive way of approaching these debates. One side have to win. And as a Nordic person who's from a collective, more collective society, I always kind of seek the trade union as. I feel that collective approaches can look, we have versions of that, and maybe we can discuss might look as an alternative. So I'll talk really. What we're trying to do in our project, we are just starting out discussing how it's going to look. So I'm going to ask you for some feedback and ideas of how we should approach this. Is to try and unpack some of these complex intersectional dimensions of the lived experiences of working in higher education in the UK, and particularly for staff. This is also in response to going beyond the tick box exercise of seen as one, and seeing if we can have some kind of action points and informed campaigns through the UC. It's useful to have you on board. And what we've done so far is to start designing a pilot survey. So what we are hoping to do this spring is to start mapping things like, what are the pay gaps? Are there any queer LGBTQIA plus pay gaps? What happens to our promotion processes or the lack thereof? What kind of issues are around teaching and outness, care arrangements for non-heteronormative families or family setups that are different, experiences of microaggressions, stress, burnout, emotional labor, workload, job support or not job support. I've been thinking of naming my plants with human names so that I can say that someone's sick, because it's easier to get time off in that way than if I use another reason that in my eyes is equally legit, but you know, it's not so in a heteronormative job situation. And also whether or not to understand some of the job insecurity or security that for LGBTQIA staff. So far, what we're trying to do is to design a pilot survey, and these are just some of the themes. So what I want to ask you in just 1 or 2 minutes is if you can discuss amongst each other any issues or areas or dimensions that you think we should include in such a study. And so we'll carry out a pilot survey this spring and do interviews of experiences, which we'll present at the UCU conference this in May. Is it called Equality Conference?
Equality Research Conference.
Equality Research Conference in May.
Friday the 15th of May in Manchester.
Yeah.
Shameless plug.
And then we will take it from there and hopefully shape a bigger, larger project that will be nationwide and stationable. So I think I'll leave it there, and I just want you to talk to the person next to you. I'm taking your job. Speak to the person next to you and think about, and we really welcome any kind of suggestions on issues we should ask about, things we should include.
Which could also include issues for students in terms, because in the bigger project, after the pilot would also include student experience.
And I also feel in particular for precarious staff, people that are PhD students, hourly paid lecturers, anyone who are on different kinds of contracts.
Opportunity to influence the research agenda. So if you'd like to just talk to your neighbour and say, what would you like researched? Brilliant.
I'm Anna, I'm the Master's representative for the Master. I wonder how it's for both of you, sort of research agendas, how the UCU work with not just academic staff. Sorry, who's back?
Is it your bag?
It's very nice it's actually found. Sorry.
So how do UCU and how sort of higher education plans on working not just with academics and not just with students, but people you might not think about, so your cleaners or the admin staff or disability support staff. Where do we kind of fit into things if we don't?
We take a few more suggestions and then come back. Come on, hands up. Rosa.
There you are. I'm Rosa. I'm a PhD student in education. Not really fully forward because I've got this sort of concern. No, yeah. But it's coming up. So yesterday we were having was that quite often all of this kind of really important work and advocacy. One of the things we were talking about, like changes, even to the level of kind of thinking about actually kind of this work.
Thank you, Rosa. Go on. Some other comments before we come back?
I'm Paul from PhD, social work PhD student here at Sussex, but I'm also part of the Rainbow Chorus. We're a LGBT. I think we've got a plus on now. I'm fighting for different things to be added on. Anyway, and we're a community choir. So basically, all we do is that seems to go down really well, but it seems to. Well, I guess what my point is that with this kind of the veneer of queer and this idea of those kind of sometimes marginalising ourselves, making ourselves different, reverse discourse, all of this kind of stuff that can happen. For example, I find it very difficult to go to and there's certain things that I guess I do and that I feel comfortable within this. Then we're talking about how it can take a toll on you, and we should be supportive on how other people tackle it. So I guess what I think is quite interesting is not just looking at these big things that people do in terms of their lives, in terms of changing policy, because some people aren't privileged, don't have that privilege or aren't able to do that. How some people can do these little micro things like be part of a choir, which isn't much for me, as it is that we can be, even in the times of TERFs, we can be together and produce something quite amazing, etc. So it's the little things as well that we get support in terms of who we are, but also those little bits of activism, if you could even call it.
Great, lovely, thank you. Would you like to come back on this?
Sure. Anna, I'll address Anna's point first around the kind of academic support part of UCU members. Yeah. So there's a level to which that's within that, and there's provision within the UCU structures for that voice to come forward, academic related committee, etc. So that's definitely of great interest. And in terms of the resources we produce, they're definitely not kind of like necessarily coming from an academic perspective, but about actually what can be done to further LGBT plus equality in relation to, for example, cleaners, etc. Then that would be membership of another union, and then the recognition of other unions within any organisation is really important to have those relationships where reps are talking to each other. Sometimes it can be that the LGBT staff plus staff network can be a really good place for different union activists to be talking to each other and being able to put forward things that actually pertain to all of them. But then obviously within the TUC, there is relationship between the different unions as well. So, are we addressing all the points? Or
yes.
Okay,
great.
fine. I think in relation to, is it Laura? Sorry. Rosa. Right. Apologies. I think you raised something there around emotional labour and the kind of recognition of representation and advocacy in relation to LGBT plus, and it just being kind of like, well, we're talking about LGBT plus person when we need to be putting in the submission, right? Without recognising that actually that is extra to what you are doing within the place within your university. I think it is something that we're definitely already talked about being within the research that we're doing and how that comes about. It's necessary to be able to scratch beneath the veneer and look at what is happening and be able to give voice to that. And I think at the moment that's not being articulated enough, though it is cropping up in many different circles, particularly in relation to Athena's. And Paul, having been in the Rainbow Voices in Birmingham some time ago, yes, I know what you mean about being in the choir there. It's important that we bring up those kind of like knowing the people who are alongside us. Truda was talking earlier about finding people in your tribe. I think that is an important point in relation to kind of like getting that support, finding people who can talk to you, finding people who you can talk to, you can talk with, to be able to talk about how that relationship with the workplace, which is so heteronormative, is taking a toll on you. I think that is something which is really important within an organization, that people are aware of the dissatisfaction within an organization that is trying to be LGBT plus friendly by putting up the rainbow flag, that actually they're only scratching the surface. And we need, again, the articulation of that voice to happen, which we have, in a sense, talked about a bit already. So I think that's really an important contribution we can make within the research, within the survey. So, yeah. And activism, be a UCU member and come to the UCU LGBT plus members conference, which happens once a year. It's going to be first out in December this year. Be active, because we do enable that to happen within the union. So it's a really good way in. And your voices are really important. UCU's activism around LGBT plus is informed by the members. It's for the members, by the members. I'm here as a tool to be able to provide that kind of resource to make it happen. So.
And it's great fun.
More to the point, yes. Okay, next
And
round.
the Equality Research Conference. Yes, if you've done any research around LGBT plus mental health, casualisation or data, those are particular areas we're looking at within the Equality Research Conference. Please put in a submission and come to the Equality Research Conference. Otherwise, please come to it.
Great. Next round of questions, comments.
Oh, true.
Hiya, tell us who you are.
Hi, my name's Holly. I'm from professional services. I actually work in the admissions office, so I'm probably maybe one of the few people here. And I was just interested in, because I'm actually a member of Unison, and I actually went to our recent conference, which was really amazing. But I was interested in if there is the opportunity for collaboration in this project, maybe not in the pilot stage, but when it, I understand in the pilot that's getting a lot more voices involved and can halt things and make things more complicated. But when it does come to maybe a national rollout, if there is the opportunity, because within the university structure, I find there's often entrenches the distinction between faculty and professional services, or those who are not teaching or postdoc or so on and so forth. And I find that quite problematic, especially with disability, because coming from an operational side of things, you don't have the space to discuss your queerness or your identity in the way that academic staff may have more of an opportunity to do so by the nature of their roles, whereas we're told you get on with the job and nothing else really matters. And as a result, I've mentioned this, I'm actually here in my own time and not as a member of staff. I've taken the afternoon off to come here because that's how I've been told to attend this. So I'm here as just on my free time, it's been taken out of my work day. Now, that's very common for a lot of other LGBT people I know in the office, and they don't feel comfortable asking to come to events like this because, well, it's time away from your job, and it's not related. Where obviously the irony was not lost on me that it was called Erasure and Visibility, and I am in my own time, and I don't think they picked up on that either. But I think there's a massive portion of staff here who would be really interested in being involved in that, and not something that isn't a tick box exercise like the Stonewall survey that's been sent round by the LGBTQIA at Sussex. So I was really interested in that,
Lovely, lovely. Quite a lot in there, so I just wondered if you'd like the opportunity to come back before we move on.
Yeah, I see there's a hand up behind.
Okay,
I can take that and then.
I don't know if it's a comment or a question, but it kind of relates to what you just said. I don't know if there's maybe space to look into like the fracturing of contracts within academic staff and non-academic staff, and how that impacts people's ability to do their work. So whether it's pastoral care, non-pastoral care, that sort of staff providing more broadly, LGBT students and LGBT lecturers, and therefore how that may or may not impact the steps of community that exist here.
Yeah, I was going to say earlier that I feel that, in terms of the further questions, in terms research project as an opportunity to create across all of these groups, because I have the same experience working at the university of we have the professional services staff, and then we have the academics, and then we have the others who are completely invisible to academics. Often, you know, we don't even like, you know, there's so much invisibilization within the university itself that goes way beyond LGBTQIA issues, and I think that this is really an opportunity for a project where we can cross that. We have been talking about working with Unison. I think, yeah.
The Pride and Prejudice in Education, which I've already put up there, I said about working with NUS and Advanced HE, also worked with Unison as well. There are various projects. I mean, Voice and Visibility as well. Unison was a very key part of putting that together. So we've got a history of working together very much on different things. So if it becomes something that we look at stretching out further, it's something which is investigated in the initial project. So.
I also wanted to say in terms of everyone should do this kind of work. Can do this kind of work while can't do this kind of work in the same way as we can. And in that sense, I think it is really important to do this, include others, and enable kind of people can find their tribes in some way or another.
And emerging here about the lack of interface of the different policies. The policies tend to operate on completely separate trajectories here, so you don't get any interface between the LGBT activities, the internationalisation policy discourse, etc., the health and well-being. They're all very, very separate. I think the point that you made about internationalisation is just absolutely huge, because Sussex badges itself in being a big international university. We've never had any kind of debate about the implications that has for gay internationalists, and we're increasingly at risk. And we've been doing research on internationalisation in CHEER, and it's a completely disqualified discourse. You know, who has the right to internationalise? Who is a desirable international subject? I not asked. And what sort of discursive space is there once you're undertaking internationalised work? And we've often, when we've discussed this, found there's been a massive code switching required. And you have to not talk about huge aspects of your life because you lose all credibility in certain contexts. This is an area just screaming out to be researched. We'll do the research.
And we have a joint MA programme with somewhere that criminalises homosexuality.
Absolutely, and we have huge big contracts around the world with countries that criminalise homosexuality. Massive international development contracts, massive consultancy contracts. We're working with Saudi, we're working with Uganda, places where people are being hanged. And if ever you raise this in a staff meeting, you are the killjoy. You're going against the neoliberal financialisation agenda, and you're destroying the market image of the university. So it's a huge amount there to be theorised, I'd say, in research. So we've got some more. Let's me shut up. Some more questions. Yes.
I think it'd be quite interesting to research the increased burden that academic staff have to take on, gatekeeping around student support services, so how you can only get certain support if or you meet disability thresholds or whatever, which ultimately means staff are expected to provide increasing pastoral support. Staff can sort of be a benefits advisor, a disability advisor, a housing advisor. So when your mental health is bad, because so how that fits around increasing casualisation, and so where students are increasingly reliant on academic staff, that sort of support, and then your contracts are cut, so it kind of creates to provide and what they're paid to provide.
Good. More? Did you have your hand up?
Yeah.
There you are.
Yeah, so I'm Tab Betts. I'm a lecturer in higher education. Part of my job is actually helping to run the PGCERT HE, which is, so one of the things that I think, both in terms of this research project, maybe as a question for everybody here today, are there any kind of practical more inclusive embedded within the support services that we have at the classroom spaces, how we teach, because I can support students more generally. Get out of some practical tips out of this research.
Over to the two of you.
I was going to say in terms of the increasing pressure on doing pastoral support, what we were thinking of including is questions around emotional labor as well, in particular whether or not do LGBTQIA plus staff take on or have to take on more of the emotional labor, which is something we would want to look into. I don't know. I mean, I'm trying out this in my teaching this year in terms of having the first week on being how can we have an inclusive teaching and learning environment in all of my seminar groups and getting students to write lists and really engage with that in the teaching. I'm not sure how well it's working yet, but I mean, that's one thing in terms of the teaching, to actually dedicate a whole week to do that. Now, how much scope there is to do that in all modules, I don't really know. But then, I think really, yeah. My fear is always if we have tips that it becomes another tick box. I wonder how we can get beyond that.
I think from a union perspective, it is really important to have the practicalities. And to look at how that feeds into a bargaining agenda at the local level. So definitely I will be looking for that. Whether that becomes a checklist tip thing, that's another matter. I think it's actually what the findings are that say about that reveal what actually people are feeling, are experiencing, and actually looking at what might be a way forward, a campaigning way forward, a practical way forward for that the union can pick up. So it coming out from the research, definitely something practical that can then become part of the bargaining and negotiating agenda, because that is where it's going to make a difference for people at the ground level, whether that be in terms of UCU academic or academic related stuff, but also stretching out further other unions too.
But I often say, we often get asked to resolve our own problems in inclusivity. So often I might raise this in a management. Stop being prejudiced. I can't be the bearer of your prejudice and then tell you how to resolve it. You know what I mean? I'm not at all trying to diminish your position at the tip. But the much more profound structural adjustment that needs to take place has to come from, not just from us guiding it. You know what I mean?
And how do you do this without buying into the melancholy, fragile queer discourse? Okay, quickly, Daniela.
I'm really sorry, I've got to go and teach, so I'm really sorry, but I'll see some of you this evening.
Thank you so much. Daniela,
Yeah,
tell us who you are.
I'm Daniela. I'm the education. And I guess I'm interested also in like the compilation of erasures from international work and doing different things like in disabilities as an international student. There's different kinds of support than there would be for English students. And I don't think it's at all adequate or considers PhD students for their particular needs, while those needs still exist and you've exhausted all your social resources by now. And then at the same time doing international work, I mean, I've had my relationship with organizations threatened because of your engagement just with friends on Facebook without acknowledging existing in any way in that space as well as here. So the lack of protection from the organization seems disconnected from the university, but it's also transient between career spaces and we've talked a lot about the erasures that happen in community spaces here and the weight it carries as like somebody who front runs issues around children in poverty in rural areas, and you end up kind of working really hard to open that space and taking a lot of this off. So I don't really know how you get at those things or how you help support people to keep going with those areas. But
Right, lovely. Yes, a question?
I have a question for Seth in particular. Would like to take part of this drive but are afraid of direct or academic to progress. So
Okay, so we have a rapid set of responses before we move on to Sean and Yasser.
Yeah. The usual for UCU when people are going on strike. I think if you have a particular perspective on that, experience of that as queer, then that definitely needs to be fed in through the local branch or through your region as part of that support. But you can also look at what we're doing nationally as well. So it's kind of like, if you've got concerns that pertain to equality, particularly, then that has got to come through our structures.
Any other responses? The international one again?
Well, I think for me personally, I've been doing work on LGBTQIA issues internationally, and I have felt the need to have more support for my own safety. And it hasn't been there.
No.
So I think it's definitely something we need to work on. Yeah.
There's a peculiar power relation, isn't it? International work is often seen as your hobby. It's a gift that the university's given you rather than the other way around, and that you have to just manage the distance. Okay, a huge round for a second.
Okay, great. Let's start then.
Everybody ready? Like we are. Okay. Okay, our last presentation, talent presentation today, again, two fabulous Sussex colleagues. Sean Higgins is a lecturer in education, and Yasser Kosbar, who is a research fellow for CHEER, but also a PhD scholar, originally from Egypt, lives in Paris, studies in Britain, speaks about 6 languages. He is an absolute perfect global citizen. So, very warm welcome to you both, and over to you. The floor is yours.
All right, that was a wonderful. Should you would like to stay here or first? All right. Okay. Well, I will need this because I'm going to. We have said Louise has introduced both of us, but in fact, this is yours. It's going to be your workshop. We're throwing over thinking and doing to you. And probably reorganise everybody soon. Yeah. And I hope I won't disappoint after that wonderful introduction. Yes, I know. I mean, what can we say after that? You know, what can we say? Yes,
Speaking in Arabic and German.
Yeah. Well, I think the objective of this particular session was based on some of the reflections that we did about the role of the university as an ally and how in the UK in particular present themselves as gay-friendly and allies to the LGBTQ in terms of neoliberal knowledge economy dynamics. We have seen, or since I came to the UK, I have seen how the neoliberal forces has basically the celebration of incorporated it in terms of commercialization and very materialistic.
I would share experience with you that I also found difficulty going to the gay pride, except it's a different in a way. I didn't secure the bracelet because all corporations who sponsored the gay pride, and that was my first year here, had already the bracelet. So someone like me who physically didn't have the chance to go to this particular event means a lot. I was excluded from that just based, in economic terms. We see now similar patterns in universities, especially in areas of recruiting international students, that we have seen that holding international students holding a rainbow flag has become like front and center of the website of the universities in order to promote that recruitment of more international students without actually looking at some of international collaboration with countries that criminalize homosexuality. We have also seen how universities use the hard and visibility of many of the LGBT students and staff members in order to brand themselves as tolerant and to secure research funds. And most of the universities that get the research funds are actually I don't say highest, but one of the among the staff in terms of equality. I think as a community, while we should celebrate our visibility, I think we should now start to think about how we can reclaim that space and reclaim that narrative. Waving flags and wearing laces. And in the words of my friend Daniela yesterday, she said, "You don't need a t-shirt to be gay," and I agree with that. I mean, you don't need to wear a t-shirt or wear laces. I mean, they can be in many different ways. And I think also we should not take the degrees also for granted, because when you bring here, especially international students, all these categories that we still kind of grasp into, like for instance the queer category, that we still need to try to understand what it means, and not just take it for granted. I think, that would be.
Well, so we both thought that in thinking beyond rainbow laces associated with safe spaces and wearing t-shirts, some of the insights of Butler are quite relevant to both critique and to some of the strategies we might use to challenge this fairly assimilative agenda, I think, of integration and diversity. And you can always rely on her. I love Judith Butler's work, both because she reduces things to fundamentals, what's at stake, but she's also, I think, very practical and pragmatic. But she can't be reduced to tick boxes either. So she sort of serves our purpose in some ways. And I think this is a wonderful quote. It's about, from her work on ethics, the opacity of the subject to itself and others is the starting point of our ethical responsibility. And I suppose what she's saying there really is to foreground as the starting point of our ethical stance, our reactions to others, the mystery of the other, the unknowability of the other, and of ourselves. And of course, it's a major critique of the liberal humanist tradition, which assumes the other is knowable quickly. And I think one of the big issues we have with university agendas, and it has been repeated by all the speakers, is a very a narrow framing of the issue, as if it's resolved, foreclosed, as if there's nothing more. We've done it now. Okay, so we've managed diversity by providing you with safe spaces, and there is diversity, and you've got your t-shirts and rainbow laces to wear. And I think what's there really, and Butler really highlights it, when we think of what she's saying, that the starting point of ethics, the starting point, an ontological starting point, is the fact that we should eschew totalizing understandings, and we should avoid the gestural, and continually to engage on the basis that we don't know the other. And it seems to be the very opposite of what's happening with the neoliberal managerialism of diversity, is that there's a sense in which we do know you, we know what you need, and this is it, and this is what we're providing. And we know you, better than you know yourselves in some ways, as we're told it's a safe space. And so I think I realised that Butler's insights really resonated with everything that's been said today. And I just noted what Kathy was saying about the need to understand rather than dismiss heteronormative activism is really important. So rather than just dismiss it, we need to see it as mysterious perhaps, to get to know and understand it and engage with it. And so there's a sort of principle of action there, which can come into play based on this ethical framework. I think what Sally was saying about the need to avoid retreating into silos and echo chambers and resisting a sort of commodified diversity project is also highlights the need to not to fix somebody else, but to and fix ourselves as well, but to enter into engagement both with ourselves and others in a sort of mutual sense of our humanity, our shared humanity, but one which isn't sort of dictatorial. And then what Ping was saying about the need to challenge normative superficiality of the way the academy manages and co-opts diversity, and the idea of the queer veneer, again, seems to be eschewing what Butler's saying about the key need to engage with the mystery of the other and ourselves. I think some of you have also mentioned, I think some of the audience, the sheer multiplicity of our own queernesses and the diversity we have within ourselves. I mean, we need to understand ourselves, each other, and ourselves as well. That's a good starting point for solidarities which might challenge the heteronormativity of the academy. And navigating the bullshit, as well as you say, I think this helps us to have a degree of humility in doing so, that we don't have all the answers. We do need to engage across division and across barriers in a spirit of humility which can be opened up by Butler's insight that it's the mystery of the subject to ourselves and to others, which could be a starting point for practical action. And I think maybe if we can integrate that principle pedagogically in what we do, it might result in a variety of pedagogical actions based on that particular principle, as opposed to a tick box thing, we've got to do this, got to do that. That spirit of humility might be a way forward, a way of navigating something different. So, having said that, we'd like to ask you to consider 3 questions. What we mean by safe spaces, what your experience is of safe spaces, and how you'd like to re-envision the concept of safe spaces. So we're just opening up entirely to interrogate and critique, as if this is a mystery of safe spaces. It needn't be resolved and foreclosed in a particular way, as in a sort of managerial, neoliberal university style, but entirely to undermine that and to start again, perhaps. So we wanted to maybe reorganise. I don't know whether you're used to sitting where you are now and in your groups, but if you can get into groups of 2 or 3, that'd be lovely, and just talk about this, and then we can really gather ideas. And I realise that Louise has said this is the penultimate session before we do concretising things for the manifesto. So in a way, we're moving towards something pragmatic now, but based on some principles. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks.
And do feel free to move around so you get to talk to somebody different. So I invite you all to stand up.
Any questions?
Do we need to like write a new part?
Okay, great. I think there's been some very lively discussions going on about all these issues, which is very good for a long day, at the end of the day, as we come to the end. But can we just hear back then from different groups, please, in some detail perhaps, about how you felt, what we mean by safe spaces, the 3 questions. And then we can, I think we're moving into the manifesto, and some pragmatic strategies might be helpful to emerge from this as well, based on a report, Louise, isn't it, which of the day. Yeah. Could we, this group over there? Do you want to, want to start us off?
Sure. I mean, I guess I was talking about how safe spaces can be very violating spaces, where it's conditioned to almost uncomfortable, and out of like respect for the facilitator, you might feel pressured to act out of your own sense of safety, and like revealing certain things to other people around. Really feel comfortable with or know enough about who is around you to not feel violated and traumatized or potentially anxious about those. I found safe spaces
mostly incredibly traumatizing and violent.
And this is the ultimate, yeah, that's the paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Especially when I was like intentionally invited into them and then felt this like power dynamic and pressure to expose certain things that were not comfortable. So I don't know if there is a way to create safe spaces that are actually safe for everyone, and especially the people who you're thinking you can make them safe for, or especially people who are experiencing things that require. However, at the same time, I do acknowledge that, like, in positions of power, like, for example, working with the international education, it can be incredibly hard to come in from all these different international spaces and have to erase yourself in order to feel safe around your peers, and it takes somebody outside of that to open up a space where you can maybe find your queer peers, to know that there's some level of camaraderie. At the same time,
Sure.
the terms of confidentiality again like need to be clearly established and kept. So whether you can do that, whether it's like a good thing to do, I'm not sure.
I think you open up, don't you, really well the micro-politics of safe spaces, which can be very diverse. Some might find them very alienating. It does depend on the micro-politics, how things work, the affective dimension of the safe space, how people find themselves in it. Does that resonate with anybody else's experiences in terms of safe spaces? The fact they can be violating, that we set ourselves up in some ways to reify something, perhaps, which can be counterproductive to the very safety we look for.
We had, as part of the choir, we had a lot of discussion about safe spaces, about the use of the word, creating a safe space. And, and I kind of said earlier that I was trying to add letters onto and to the point where, you know, I think it's really important that we have allies, for example, there. But one of the conversations that we had was around, well, actually, the trouble is that, and this is normally by non-trans members, saying, well, actually, the trans members might find that really, really difficult and a really unsafe space if heterosexual people come. It was very bizarre to have that conversation. When we're in this kind of, we're in a situation where actually some gay people are transphobic and some straight people are. So we try to get rid of this idea of having a safe space, especially. I think we're quite lucky in that we do work as a kind of community. We are very diverse, but we engage in relationships with each other, and there is part of what we do can be difficult, and part of what we've got there's lots of divas, for example. Want to do this.
Yeah, it can be difficult.
There's no such thing as a safe space, but it's about respect for each other, and it's about and understanding that there will be conflicts.
Indeed.
Actually, and in order to be progressive, if we want to call ourselves progressive, then we need to progress. We can't just say, I'm progressive because I'm here now. You want to be progressive, you need to be progressing. Which can't happen in a safe space.
No, so there's a sort of lazy consensualism, isn't there, about this notion of safe spaces then? It avoids agonism, which matters,
I was kind of from that. I think it's more about trying to identify when it's unsafe, as opposed to marking it out as a safe space. And that this conflict is saying, now this conversation is an unsafe conversation, but as in like this is now you're running the risk of violating other people. And that's instead of marking it as a safe space, and then when these conversations do happen, it's about identifying when that violation is taking place, and then being like, we need to have a discussion around that instead, as a kind of a way to not kind of mark out these physical spaces or ideas, and it's more about, I don't know, just I don't know if that's just.
Well, I think that's really interesting because I think part of the purpose of the university is to challenge things, to have difficult conversations about things. So it's interesting to frame it as a non-violatory space as opposed to a safe space, because in a completely safe space, you wouldn't have that really challenging discourse and be able to dig into difficult topics.
There's an issue of, as speaking of, as I said, is the violence within these safe spaces in terms of the interactions among the group. And I think once we mark, a certain place as a safe space, and you as a person kind of, say, oh, well, within that space, I faced homophobia, then once you raise that problem, you become the problem, because the assumption here is that, oh, it's a safe space, it's you must have misunderstood. No, this person didn't mean that. It's kind of a sort of a gaslighting strategy to kind of make you think, oh, well, yeah, perhaps, and it's always, especially when you are a non-native speaker, it's always like, oh, no, that's the British way of saying this, or that's an English thing. It's always deflecting. But I think homophobia doesn't have a language. It's a universal. You would pick it up. So I think it's always kind of, again, blames on you once you have that safe space. And we brought, I think, the example of Brighton, of being in Brighton, because if any time I see anything, everybody's like, that must it must have been that must have been what here? No, like we are the only place, and there's a kind of a local pride to it, because it kind of brings that, challenges that notion that a lot of people want to believe that they are tolerant and diverse, and so then you go back and you said, well, maybe perhaps I was. You blame yourself, and then you become silent.
Yeah, I was thinking that, well, on the one hand, I feel like it's not a safe space. It's kind of it's a verb. It's an ongoing practice to make something safer. And I feel if we're going to have some kind of re-envisioning of it, I think that having a space where it's welcome to have controversial and difficult conversation and to be the problem without being the problem. I think that's extremely important. I think we were talking about how the assumption that everyone that's in any way diverse is assumed to like each other and get along. I mean, I've experiences of here is another queer colleague, you'll be a friend. And there is something about the sameness and diversity usually I feel needs.
So obviously safe spaces, geographers have talked about this for a little while, and are really the notion of it not being. And it brings me back, and I know I don't want to be old, but I think I'm getting older, to those conversations about buying. I'm not middle-aged. 3 more years, not being middle-aged. About bi inclusions back in the day when we were doing Count Me in Two, and actually LGBT groups saying we are not doing bi inclusion until we properly do it. We're not just adding B&T on until we do it properly. And actually, that safer space is a lot of work, and it's a lot of effort, and it's a lot of time, and it's about difficult conversations. But I think we also need to acknowledge that some spaces need to be exclusionary, whether that's people of colour spaces, whether that's trans spaces, whether that's, and actually that is okay too. Creating those spaces and whatever that makes. We also need to acknowledge that for some people, conflict is really difficult. Constantly challenged on everything, that space becomes less safe for them. Whilst it might make somebody else feel safer, it might also make it a problem for other people. So those difficult conversations also need to be marked as, in the creation of safer space. Some people, that conflict will be enough to drive. And it is, I think it's difficult, and I think if it's easy, then we're doing it wrong. And if we keep that in mind, I think that's really, really.
The question I had was who identifies and maintains the boundaries of the safe space? Who are the gatekeepers? And who's allowed in and who's excluded? And that's relates very much to identity reification. What sort of fluidity is there involved? And I'm also hearing something that's been discussed for decades now about the hierarchy of oppression and now I think it's known as Oppression Olympics. You know, that we have been very carefully positioned to attack each other. And I know we haven't had a lot of time to socially contextualise this afternoon, but I haven't heard the word austerity mentioned, which I heard the post-Brexit, but austerity has been a major player in a lot of this tension and the hate crimes and the backlash, etc. We've talked about neoliberalism, but I think that's a very important context, that we have to resist being positioned in competition with each other, because meanwhile, and this has been happening for decades. I used to work in the GLC in the 80s, the Greater London Council, where the Women's Committee imploded because all the different identity groups within the Women's Committee were all turned against each other. Meanwhile, heteropatriarchy thrived, it just thrived, it flourished, it ran away with it. And I think there's a real danger that we're reproducing that dynamic now, and that we put a lot of attention into attacking each other, when perhaps sometimes we do need to redirect the gaze.
I think I have some. Yeah.
I was just one of the thoughts that came to me about the whole idea of the safe spaces, the idea that a lot of these people who access these spaces or feel the need to access them are experiences, and yet one of the most prominent responses that they get from that is just sympathy, or empty sympathy, and they feel like a victim. And I think it's really important just to work on how that space responds to people sharing their experiences and sharing their stories, because many people have gone through that trauma, have resolved it, and then have come to a space where they feel like they are weak, they feel like they are less than just because they are a victim. I think also made a good point earlier about being the. It's not going to matter of actively telling stories of, instances of discrimination, but even, people in this room just recounting a basic story from just recounting a lived experience, as a lot of the time they do end up being negative. You end up becoming down as just by doing something which a straight cisgendered person could do so easily. You become almost that. You become stereotyped. You become pushed into a corner because all you talk about is as you said, you're a downer.
I would say one thing on the last question, how would we like to re-envision this concept? I would like to see queer safe spaces which focus less around sex. I find that, it's great, it's fun, we'll love it, some of us love it, but I do find that a lot of queer spaces, particularly with young people, the focus is on sex and is on if I look at myself 10 years ago, getting into that kind of community, it's something that is very normalised, I think, with a lot of young queer. That perhaps is something that could be rethought, that maybe it's not the be-all and end-all of who we are, maybe we can be a little bit more. This idea of like queer spaces and queer safe spaces, sexual spaces is something which is quite damaging.
Absolutely. Some queer spaces built by gay men can be very self-destructive, perhaps, as well.
Yeah.
Linked to drugs and drink. But research has shown that that's absolutely resulting from homophobia and internalised low self-esteem, which is taken to these activities as well. So queer spaces could perhaps support people going through those processes as well, without judging them, perhaps, as well.
Sorry, I don't know. Your point at the back is almost the same, really. Oftentimes, people making those boundaries and creating those safe spaces are survivors of trauma, and how we deal with trauma by attacking each other is one of the key ways that so it's not just about other people telling us to win. You can win against the person beside you. You can't win against the man. And that kind of trauma and how it plays out in these spaces is often.
It's such a rich discussion, isn't it? I think we're collapsing all the questions together, really, as they should be, perhaps collapsed. Yeah. So any other comments and issues? Yeah.
I spoke about it earlier in a slide, and it's the experience of safe spaces. And I recently, relatively recently, went to the Sussex LGBT network, one of their kind of brainstorming, but it's one of their kind of strategizing meetings. And I went there very pumped up, very excited, and I left feeling very disheartened because I felt like it was a strand of the EDI. It was the entire agenda, like what was being discussed, was exclusively on how the network can help facilitate the EDI policy, the inclusion of equality, diversity.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So that's like the management. Yeah. That's their unit. They've also rolled out diversity champions, which I think is a very odd choice of words. I don't know how you can champion. I don't know if they're champions of it. I don't really understand. But I went into this space being very excited about getting more involved and what was going on. And unfortunately, when I thought a safe space where, you know, people like-minded people, or people at least identify under the rainbow umbrella meet, but I was really disheartened by the fact that it was about furthering the policies of the EDI, and I stepped away being like, you know, I'd actually don't want anything to do with this, because I felt the network should be informing the EDI and not the other way around. And I felt that was a real shame, and they said, oh, you know, we want more people to get involved, but I think they've kind of shut those doors off by the fact that they have been so clearly pushing forward a university kind of.
Sounds so regulatory, doesn't it? Really?
Yeah, and you know, and there was also a massive violation. I don't know if anyone in this room is part of the network. There was a massive violation where, there was a massive violation where someone accidentally said reply all to an email about the Stonewall survey, but only to members of the network, so outed whoever was in that email to one another. And there was a good like 45, 50 people.
More, I think.
Was there more?
Yeah,
there was
more.
There was lots of people. Now there's a couple of colleagues in my office who we're out, we know one another, but there are also some people in my office and colleagues people I've emailed across the university whom I don't know, and were in this, and I thought that was appalling, because we were just kind of like, did that just happen? Like,
it's also illegal and potentially
and all that happened was sorry, I'm not very good at Outlook.
Yeah, it was really like, it was a
and
horrible
then it just kind of went away, and I wanted to do something that I wasn't sure. And for me, I was like, I don't know where to take that.
But I just
no. At the time, I don't. You know that it was. You know that was.
Can I just mention one more thing? I think there's also that, you know, consumerist, or the consumption. We are encouraged, and here I'm taking this stand of students, that sometimes you are encouraged to say your experience and narratives, and then these experience and narratives are taken, you know, to whatever formulate, whatever policy, and then there was always, when you leave this place, you feel exhausted. There's always a constant consumption of your narratives that it's not addressed adequately also in university, and what the emotional toll of these safe spaces on us. You say we encourage you to talk about trauma, but still these are kind of exhausting experiences. Knowledge, you know, the kind of ramifications that will happen after, you know, when you go outside that safe space, or we go after that session.
I think a key theme from all of today has been the sheer emotional labour of all of this.
Yeah.
It really does take its toll on us on a day-to-day basis. Yeah.
I mean, added to that, when you were talking, I was describing as a gaslighting relationship with the TERFs and heteroactivists. You know, not only do we have our own individual traumas, but we are being told as groups that what you're saying is not a problem. You know, the whole thing is framed as not, you're misunderstanding this, you know. So there's quite a strong sense of abuse in the whole situation.
Shall we move on now to Sally's concluding response? Jump into action. And any points that anybody wants Seth to hear in terms of action, manifesto for change. What's next? So, Sally, very briefly to conclude.
Please feel free to interrupt. Although I love having the last word, you know, it's so delightful, isn't it? One of the issues about being 60 next month is that you've been around quite a while in subcultural politics and in oppositional politics of one kind or another. And there is quite a lot of echoes for me at the moment that I feel I lived through in the 70s and the 80s around debates around identity politics, debates around sameness and difference. You know, those of you who have done your feminist history may know about the Barnard Conference about sex that was in New York and the subsequent publication after it, and the huge divisions around SM activists, sadomasochism, sex and activists, and radical feminists and lesbian feminists at the time. And there's something uncannily reminiscent to me about some of the comments made today, which are about staking a certain kind of claim and saying, I am in this corner and those people over there are the enemy. And I guess I feel that there's something really sad about that. That actually what happens is every 20 years, new words come up, new concepts come up, new identities come up, and then there starts to be a new set of crises and conflicts around these definitions, which I suppose is also about our human need to find sameness, not difference, sameness. There's a kind of neurosis in being human, which is I must find people that mirror myself and my own beliefs. And in order to feel ontological security as humans, we feel a fairly desperate desire to find other humans that reflect back to us what we believe ourselves to be. And the problem with that, of course, is first of all, what we believe ourselves to be for large numbers of people changes over the course of your lifetime. So I don't identify much with LGBT anymore as a kind of community or group. I mean, I'm a friend and it was me, but I don't feel that that is a safe space for me anymore. Not because I have any hostility, aggression or disappointment or any of those things. I just don't, it doesn't do it for me. But it certainly did it for me 30 years ago, 20 years ago, possibly even 10 years ago. But you know, but the thing about living a long life is who you believe yourself to be is, like Butler says, actually unknown to yourself in really profound ways. And we fix upon these meanings and these labels and these symbols very necessarily to create a sense of comfort for ourselves. This is also part of the human condition that we do that. But it's innately insecure because of the kind of transitory nature of our existence, I guess, is the kind of posh way of saying it. And the way in which I think we feel that we must be reflected in each other is, I think, not intrinsically radical politically at all. In fact, that's what white Christian nationalists are doing right now. There's nothing intrinsically safe or radical in looking for people who are the same in order to feel validated. And I think one of the problems for the left politically is that we dangerously mobilise around victimhood as a trope, I think. And the problem with mobilising around victimhood is, sorry I forgot your name, but chap over there and Kath have said, is that is a trauma-based identity movement or identity function. And the problem with trauma I'm a psychotherapist as well as an academic, is that it tends to create hypervigilance about threat. And what I see happening, you know, in LGBT politics now and, well, forever really, and feminism, is that there's an awful lot of mobilisation around wanting to find sameness and identification and having a perceived a perceived threat. And I think the problem with that is that actually there really is a threat, and it's a threat to life. And that's in the right-wing populism and Trump and, you know, all those things we know. So there really is a threat, but I think what Louise said is very true, which is that, I think it was Louise, is that we mobilise instead against our friends, and we create enemies inside of the safe space that isn't, of course, instead of, and actually that's exactly how capitalism functions, you know, is that it pits us against each other, so our energies are drained by, you know, theological differences, basically. And I'm sorry to say, I think this happens when people talk about TERFs. I think that's unfortunate. I think that that whole debate in Britain at the moment has gone nuclear in a way that perhaps we'll look back on in 10 years' time and think, you know, what were we thinking? Because actually the government fucked us all while we were doing that. So, you know, I realise that's a massively contentious point to make, and I'm not going to develop it any further. I just want to drop it in for people to think about. So my fear is that, or my hope is that we managed to somehow mobilise ourselves to move past victim-based identifications. Because victim-based identifications are very useful politically, but it's exactly what white people in the US are doing right now. You know, the reason why Trump is successful is because right-wing nationalist white Christian people feel themselves to be victims. They feel themselves to be victims of the liberal kind of elite. And it's a very successful way of mobilising people, but it's a very dangerous kind of mobilisation to mobilise around victimhood. Having said that though, there are obviously traumas in terms of being minoritarian, whatever. So I guess the issue for me is, how do we negotiate the tricky land between sameness and difference? And I'm sure actually we could go back to the 1980s, and I'm quite sure actually black feminism had a lot to say about this during the 1980s. But I also feel that one thing that we can probably consider a bit more deeply is the effect of trauma on all of us, because life hurts. And if we imagine that our hurt is somehow deeper and more raw and more profound than other people's, then I think we're missing an opportunity to build empathy and alliances with others, irrespective of their sexuality, frankly. So I think that's all I had to say. We need more friendship, is what I ended up with, across identity differences. That's it, really.
Fabulous. I suggest we end on that wonderfully uplifting, hopeful, joyful observation. And as we've been saying, let's resist the divide and conquer imperative, which allows the heteropatriarchy and heteronormativity to just allow us to thrive. So we build alliances, we build friendship. Please come back to our next event, and thank you all very much